In this industry, greatness is one thing, but it's quite another to release a game so significant that you can draw a distinct line between what the industry was before and after it released, to make such a contribution to gaming history and culture that it affects, potentially even causes, anything else to follow in its particular sphere. This list is full of those games. Some of them created genres, or at least refined an existing formula to the point that a new genre classification was necessary. Others were milestones that drove the entire industry forward in other ways, maybe mainstream presence or technological advancement. These are the 10 most important games ever released. As a Final Fantasy XIV player, I acknowledge wholeheartedly that my MMO of choice may have never existed, or at least reached its current form, if not for the previous work Blizzard put into making World of Warcraft. Where MMORPGs had existed for years before with the likes of Ultima Online, EverQuest, and RuneScape, World of Warcraft was an explosive arrival that combined reasonable system requirements, an extremely well-established IP, and a fast-paced battle system that appealed to anyone who considered the previous genre offerings too lethargic to consider, into a package that completely changed the rules for any developer wanting to set foot into that space moving forward. So much so, in fact, that when Naoki Yoshida initially took over as lead producer of Final Fantasy XIV, his first assignment to the team was to have them become World of Warcraft players in order to get a real sense of what they were up against, as apparently a lot of the original version's problems stemmed from the team being genuinely unaware of the competition. The before and after of that may be the greatest testament of all to WoW's significance. It was really this or Virtua Fighter, wasn't it? In the early 90s, 3D graphics technology was still either cost-prohibitive, clumsy, or both. Sega AM2 would get things on a more sensible path with the launch of the Model 1 arcade hardware and its accompanying title, Virtua Racing. Not only did this pave the way for all of gaming to outgrow the vector-based or extreme low-polygon 3D formats that were prevalent up to that point, the likes of which we saw in games like Tempest, Star Fox, and Sylphid, it would quickly give rise to a completely new breed of racing games, what we think of as the modern-day arcade racers. It was quickly joined by Ridge Racer, Sega Rally Championship, and AM2's own follow-up in Daytona, USA, to form the Big Four of arcade racing games and re-diversify the offerings of arcades at the time, which had then been dominated by fighting games for the last couple of years. Being the original arcade racer, however, Virtua Racing has an unusual, if still very lenient, focus on real-life racing skills, like having a good approach to corners and hitting the apex as well, which later games would take the emphasis away from with distinguishing drift mechanics. It wasn't a sim by any means, but the general ideas of racing were there in a way that wouldn't be prevalent in gaming again for a few years, while also re-energizing the genre as a whole. Super Mario 64 ushered gaming into the era that Virtua Racing had promised. It's already established that I don't like it and think of it as, frankly, a bad example of a Mario game, but it's also one of the most industry-advancing titles ever released, and it was clear that developers for the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation were catastrophically unprepared to deliver or even attempt 3D content on that level, judging by the games that were available or in development for them up to that point. Sony eventually got there with the release of games like Spyro the Dragon and Ape Escape, while Sega was still an entire system away from it with the launch of the Dreamcast and Sonic Adventure. It's not that we didn't have 3 good 3D capable machines on the market when Super Mario 64 landed, it's just that EAD showed the rest of the gaming world exactly how to put those machines to use. Final Fantasy VII did not create the JRPG genre by any stretch of the imagination. We'll be getting to that. What it did do was prove to its doubters, including Squaresoft itself, that there was a vast market waiting to buy up any and all such releases that Japan felt like serving up to the West. Before Final Fantasy VII, Square spent 4th generation localizing only the safest games on the Super NES, denying the West releases like Final Fantasy V, Trials of Mana, Live Alive, Bahamut Lagoon, the first 2 Front Mission games, the entire Romancing Saga trilogy, and Alcahest. After Final Fantasy VII, Square's Western release ratio, as well as that of other prominent JRPG publishers, became much more favorable. It would go on to become the signature genre of the first 3 PlayStations, and arguably a critical battleground in the 5th-gen console war, as then Sega of America chief Bernie Stolar largely dismissed them and the treasure trove of them coming out on the Saturn in Japan, as he wanted to give the system a more dude bro appeal with an emphasis on sports games and the like. We all know how that ended, and it was because Final Fantasy VII opened the floodgates. Space Invaders is single-handedly responsible for arcades becoming the phenomenon they were in the late 70s and early 80s. It didn't necessarily do anything groundbreaking from a design perspective, rather it's the lone entry on this list that found its way here simply due to its transcendent appeal. Entire arcades were filled with this game and nothing else. Japan had a national 100 yen coin shortage just because so many of them were locked in the bowels of Space Invaders cabinets. Unlike most arcade games, which were seen as long-term investments, a single Space Invaders machine would typically pay for itself within the month, if not much sooner. Here's another good Patrick's Mom story to go into the pile that are accumulating on this channel. She was already Space Invaders obsessed before I was even born, and when we got the Atari 2600, it would be the subject of the first time I ever watched someone actively try and track down a copy of a specific game. And once she finally did, well, I'm just happy it had a 2-player co-op mode on the 2600. Even my grandma got hooked on this game, and she wouldn't see the peak of her gaming interest herself until a few years later when we got the NES. So again, transcendent appeal. Certainly there were first-person shooters before Doom landed in 1993, but none of them were nearly as good at what they did, nor did they have the multiplayer features that would help elevate Doom to the level of a cultural phenomenon. Even when it wasn't convenient enough to join a bunch of friends for a LAN deathmatch night, which were still undeniably frequent, 1v1 matches were also extremely common via direct dial-up modem connections. In many ways, Doom did for first-person shooters what a lot of games on this list did for their respective genres. It didn't create them, it just proliferated them to an indescribable degree. Doom was so significant in its arrival, and so much human productivity was lost to it, that attempts have been made to calculate just how much. Before Doom, we had Wolfenstein 3D, Blakestone, and Corridor 7. After Doom, we had Heretic, Hexen, Strife, Alien vs. Predator, Zero Tolerance, and Rise of the Triad, to just barely scratch the surface. That's how you know you're dealing with an industry changer. I'm not entirely sure what to say here about Tetris. There's a reason it's widely regarded as the safe, politically correct pick to top a greatest games of all time list, because while I don't think anyone actually believes it is the greatest, everyone has enjoyed it to enough of a degree over the years that they don't get offended when someone hands it that title. Maybe the heights that it has reached since its inception, combined with its overall lack of haters, is what makes it an actual contender for the greatest game of all time? That could be the subject for another video. For now, though, any game that launches an entire genre that includes the likes of Dr. Mario, Puzzle Fighter, and of course Lumines, and would go on to be one of the staple genres of mobile gaming when the time came for that, has to be considered as one of the most significant releases of all time. In Dragon Quest, Yuji Horii and his team found a way to transplant tabletop RPGs to the digital space, filling a major gap in the re-emergent video game industry. In fact, one of the main reasons I'm so vehemently opposed to the notion of turn-based combat being rooted in a certain era, and therefore outdated, is because it's not as if turn-based systems came along at a time when action-based combat was impossible. Rather, action-based combat is all gaming had until turn-based battles came along. With Dragon Quest having laid the groundwork, generations of what were basically master virtual GMs would be produced in the gaming space, including Hironobu Sakaguchi, Toshihiro Kondo, Akitoshi Kawazu, Katsura Hashino, and the late Takeshi Miyagi, among many, many others. There's a whole community of gamers who play JRPGs exclusively, and therefore might not be gamers at all today had Dragon Quest not started at all back in the 80s. The revolution Dragon Quest represented, and the heights that the genre it began would go on to reach, demand that it be featured prominently on this list. Truly, there were games that are today classified as fighting games before Street Fighter II came along, but there was no fighting game classification because there was not yet a need for one until Street Fighter II came along. Seemingly overnight, Akira Nishitani and Yoshiki Okamoto's reimagining of Capcom's then rudderless Street Fighter IP rejuvenated arcades to a level not seen since the previously mentioned Space Invaders. The genre expanded around it very quickly, with SNK turning around Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, and Samurai Showdown to help provide a broader foundation for what would become the fighting genre, and forcing Capcom to refine Street Fighter II over the next few years to maintain its standing as the centerpiece. It didn't take long for the CSFA, the California Street Fighter Association, to form, introducing organized tournament play to the genre, and solidifying fighting games as the first esport years before the term would ever be uttered. It might take more than a cursory look at fighting games' place in today's gaming culture to understand why Street Fighter II was such a landmark moment, but anyone who was there to see it play out in the early 90s just knows. Honorable mentions will be brief here. Obviously, I'd be remiss not to give Pong a shout-out, as it marked the arrival of video games to the mass market altogether, and was also a rare early example of direct head-to-head competitive gameplay. Pac-Man introduced the world to character-based franchises, paving the way for Nintendo's and Sega's output in the 80s and 90s. Finally, The Legend of Zelda was essentially 2600 adventure taken to a glorious extreme, with a degree of exploration that had not yet been seen up to that point, and introducing the concept of save files to the industry, allowing players to resume their progress even after shutting off the system without the use of clunky password systems. Now for number 1. The NES launched in either 1984 or 1985, depending on what part of the world you lived in, and it was accompanied by Super Mario Bros., which completely broke the previously perceived limits of what a video game could be. At the time, we were just coming off of the Atari-inflicted crash of the early 80s, and the industry was still dominated by single-screen arcade fare that focused entirely on racking up the highest score possible. In comparison, Super Mario Bros. Introduced the concept of objective-based gameplay to the industry. While it had a scoring system, it felt almost token in its presence, with the real point of the game being to navigate the 32 stages across 8 worlds, exploring and finding secrets along the way. This was exactly what gaming needed at the time, and although the NES was home to plenty of games that embodied the pre-Super Mario Bros. Era, clearly led to the vast majority of what was to come, including most of the titles previously mentioned on this list. More directly, Super Mario Bros. Was the origin point of gaming as we know it. And that's all for now. If you feel there was anything that I missed, then please be sure to let me know in the comments section below. If you like this video, then please be sure to like, share, all the usual YouTube stuff that helps grow the channel. Click the notification bell if you want to know right away when the next video goes live. I'm Patrick Mifflin, and I'll see you back here next time.